In the world of the coinless, Peter, also known as Alpha, chased down one of the remaining monsters belonging to the late Lord Draken. They both bolted through the dead forest. Twigs snapping under his boots, he leapt over a fallen tree and increased his momentum. The monster was a cheetah-themed monster, thin, armor plates covering his body, and they had spots in them resembling a cheetah. It was equipped with the ability of intense speed and overly large claws. Peter kept on its tail. Finally, it stopped in its tracks. Finally! I'm not a young man, or a young teen anymore, Peter said as he gasped for air. Your chasing me was getting boring, the cheetah monster growled. Well then, let's spice things up, Peter said with a grin. He pulled out his Zanarka Growl phone and flipped it open and pressed the center button. Then he held the phone to his ear as he threw out his other hand. Wild access! He called out. A piercing howl filled the dead forest as the morphing grid encased Peter, morphing him into his ranger form. A black ranger with armoured pads surrounding his torso, arms and legs. They were also black with white rims. His arms had golden insignias going down the shoulder. The ranger's helmet resembled the Howling Wolf Wild Force Ranger's helmet, but it was mostly black, with silver elements and a horn extending from the forehead, and the helmet's eyes glowed purple. The ranger also had a sword sheathed on its belt and a cape dripping off his shoulders. Zinaku, Dark Wolf Ranger! He called out as he slammed his foot down and took his stance. The cheetah monster flecked its claws and bolted at the Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger, slashing him several times as he bled around. The cheetah monster ran around the ranger, containing him in a twister. The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger dropped down to one knee due to the multiple slash attacks dealt to him. He gripped onto his sword and pulled it out of its sheath, and he waited for just the right moment. He then swung the sword and sent out a dark energy crescent slash, and the wave hit the cheetah monster, breaking the twister and sending the monster crashing into the ground, dry mud and dead leaves erupting into the air. It's time to rid this planet of another useless beast, the Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger grunted. He then ran his two fingers across his sword and it started to glow purple. He then swung his sword horizontally and a crescent moon energy wave escaped the sword and it hit the cheetah dead on. The monster was then thrown back. As it hit the ground, it exploded. The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger looked down at the saber. It was the Shadow Saber, belonging once to the Shadow Ranger, but altered. The wolf hilt was now dark and had bat wing-like ears and a horn that matched the one on his helmet. The blade was now black with purple hints with silver script written down it. He gripped the handle of the Shadow of the Moon Saber tightly, and then suddenly he felt something watching him. He looked around, then up into the dead trees. He saw nothing at all. He questioned his paranoia, but then he spun around and saw three rangers stood there, where the cheetah monster exploded. They looked like the long-lost Mighty Morphin Black Ranger. All three of them did, but they were grey, faded, without life. They stood there emotionless like statues. Who the hell are you guys? The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger growled. The faded ranger did not answer him. They advanced slowly. The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger dropped into his fighting stance, and the first faded ranger ran at him. He threw a punch. The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger blocked the punch with his blade, then slashed the faded ranger back. The faded ranger stumbled backwards, but overall did not seem fazed by the attack. Great, not only have I got odd-looking rangers in front of me, they're not fazed by my sword, he muttered to himself. The second and third faded rangers jumped into the fight, both of them throwing their feet out. He blocked one, but grabbed the foot of the other. He then used his strength to throw the faded ranger's foot up, flipping the ranger over, and it landed on the ground with a hard thud. He then spun around and slashed the sword out, slashing the other two rangers. He stood there as he looked down at the three faded rangers laying on the ground. Whatever you are, stay away from me and the rest of what's left here, the Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger told them. He then turned around and walked away. He left the dead forest and carried on walking, when suddenly he stopped and looked down and saw a pebble rumbling on the ground. He turned around, and from the dead forest behind him came a whole army of faded rangers. There were easily 100 of them. What the hell is this? The Zinaku Dark Wolf Ranger roared. He gripped his sword tightly and swung it, slashing several of the faded rangers. One of them grabbed onto his shoulder, and suddenly he felt his power being drained from him. He elbowed the ranger in the face, and the ranger broke the contact, but another one grabbed his arm. Then one wrapped its arm around his neck. Both of them started draining his morphing grid energy from him. He felt weaker. He swung his sword out, trying to break free, but As he jabbed his sword out, one of the faded rangers grabbed onto the blade and drained the energy from it quickly. His shadow of moon saber turned to dust in his hands. He stood there shocked. One of the faded rangers punched him in the helmet, then suddenly he demorphed. Peter stood there and felt multiple hands grabbing at him. His arms, legs and neck. He was being pulled in multiple directions as his body was being drained of life force energy. Then Peter's life, all of his memories flashed before his eyes as his body went lifeless. His entire body forced into pure energy absorbed into the faded rangers. His skeleton dropped to the floor. The Zanaku Dark Wolf Ranger was no more. Welcome to one of the biggest crossover events in Power Ranger and Kamen Rider fanfiction history, with almost 30 storylines crossing over. These storylines are written and read to you guys across multiple platforms and given to you by the 3 Ranger Bros Studios, which is hosted by Mark the Red Cornish Ranger, Cosplay Dude 637, and myself, Ty Tiger. So prepare to dive into a storyline that not only crosses over all these stories, but hosts a threat that is willing to take down the entire multiverse as we know it. Let us begin. Rangers and Riders Unite. War for the Multiverse. Part 5. Giving a face and a name to the enemy. Tommy stood there before the small makeshift team. Guys, whilst we're here and we wait for backup, we need to start evacuating everyone that's left. Here's Albert with more detail about where we are and how we can use it to our advantage, Tommy told the group. Albert stood forward. Thanks, Tommy. Welcome to our home, guys. We already know Luca and Mark. We only have 2 rangers in this universe, but they're well equipped and well trained. Also, where you're stood is an old abandoned ruin of an ancient temple site. This place may look like it's only got 2 levels, but it's got several underground levels as well, that only magical wielders or those from magical realms can enter. I can open it and allow our refugees to hide in there temporarily, whilst we use this place's size and depth to our advantage, Albert explained.
A diversion disguised as a sneak attack. I think this might just work.
Mark butted in. Whatever we have to do to beat those things, Jacob growled. We will, don't worry, man. Trini nodded, her eyes glazed with the build-up of tears. Let's get the refugees safe and start planning, Dante ordered. Alright guys, follow me and Luca, Ozzy called out. Luca and Ozzy then led the refugees further down into the sub-levels of the temple. Go with them, Albert ordered the remaining members of the Grid Champions. Hell no, we're fighting, Lacey snapped. If we lose, if we die here, we need another line of defense, Albert hissed. Lacey stood there for a moment, and then she rolled her eyes and let out a sigh. Fine, Lacey snapped. Lacey and Tank then followed the refugees. Mark, Tommy and Dante started making plans. The Fadenizers appeared around the temple. A whole army ready. One by one they advanced inside, and the blue Resha train mecha floated on the energy train tracks above the temple, waiting. The Fadenizers stormed the main room that Albert had sectioned into a living area, a kitchen area, and a set of beds. The Fadenizers kept their numbers small, only having a few in the main room. Some stood in the massive arched entrance, and a small group of Fadenizers explored the room, making sure that they took every single corner and explored every inch. Trini and Mark suddenly jumped out of the shadows and attacked the Fadenizers. They kept their fighting and footing light. They didn't stand on the same spot for too long. They threw out their fists and feet, hitting the Fadenizers, making sure not to allow them to touch them. Mark summoned the power sword and started swinging it around. Albert then jumped out of the shadows and into the air. He held up his ring and pulled out the jungle shark sabers. He landed right in the middle of the group of Fadenizers and started swinging, forcing the Fadenizers to break rank. Outside of the temple, a portal opened and the Ultra Megazord landed on the ground. Several Rangers landed next to it, and they decided to attack the Fadenizers that waited outside. The Ultra Megazord jumped up and landed on top of the train mecha. It summoned its Ultra Sword and stabbed the train. The train mecha started draining the Ultra Grid energy from the Megazord. The Megazord lifted its foot and stomped on the handle of the sword, pushing it further into the mecha. Then it jumped off the mecha and slotted its hands into the crack made by the sword and pulled the train into 2 pieces. Guys, mecha is down. We don't know how much of a window you have, but you've got one for now, the Blue Ultra Ranger said.
It's good enough. Thanks, Billy.
Mark replied. Mark and Trini then morphed. The Red Cornish Ranger and the Yellow Ultra Ranger ran into the group of Fadenizers, and they were joined by the Kamen Rider Wizard in his water form and the Blue Time Force Ranger, both joining in and slashing down the Fadenizers. One by one, the Fadenizers were defeated, rendered nothing but dust, until finally the Rangers and Riders stood victorious. Everyone all grouped up with the main room of the temple. Albert led the refugees out into the main room, and the Blue Ultra Ranger opened 2 portals as he left the Ultra Megazord, and one by one everyone evacuated Earth-35. First the refugees. Once they were in the clear, the morphed heroes left the universe. The last few Rangers and Kamen Rider Wizard looked around and sighed. They were grateful they won at least one fight. They managed to save one universe. Suddenly, something came falling out of the sky. It was small and encased with a mixture of morphing grid and ultra grid energies. The portals closed suddenly. The Blue Ultra Ranger tried to open another portal, but with no luck. The incoming projectile hit the temple. The entire building imploded. The remaining Rangers and the Kamen Rider Wizard were crushed under the rubble as the ancient temple fell on them. Billy opened his eyes and coughed heavily due to the dust and smoke. He rubbed his eyes clear and found his glasses, now broken, laid next to him. He then pushed a piece of rubble off his leg and slid himself across the ground slightly so he could climb to his feet. Billy looked around and saw his friends and allies all recovering from the attack. He stood there dumbfounded. "How did we survive this?" Billy muttered. "I didn't want to kill you, Cranston. So I didn't," a voice grumbled. Billy looked around and saw a figure stood there, a man in his mid-20s, with brown hair, short and spiked. One of his arms was armoured. It looked like Tommy's white Ultra Ranger sleeve. His other arm was also armoured, but it was split into 2 separate sections. His forearm and hand looked like the Navy Thunder Rangers, and then his shoulder pad resembled that of the Apex Rangers. "Who are you?" Billy called out. He advanced towards the strange individual. "My human name was Dross, or Durus, but I am now something more, something better," the person replied, flexing his hands. "You're fused with the Morphing Grid, Apex Grid, and Ultra Grid. But how?" Billy Cranston asked. "I was shown how. My mentor showed me the way. All I needed was life force energy," Durus told him. "'Cause one human cannot be all 3. You're like a walking life force battery. You're behind the wipeout of multiple universes," Billy gasped. Good. You clicked on quicker than most Cranstons I've met," Durus chuckled. Why? Why go through all of this?" Billy asked. "I must make everything right. Set things back to the way they were," Durus growled. "But you killed a lot of people. People that we cared about," Billy snapped. "You were not there. None of you were. I had to do everything on my own. You sat on your Earth and played hero, whilst my home went downhill. My home died. My home fell apart," Durus grunted. "There's no excuse to murdering everyone," Billy roared. Durus moved like a swift breeze, and within a second he was in front of Billy. His hand clenched around Billy's throat, and Billy's eyes widened as his windpipe was being crushed. "I need all of it. The multiverse screwed me over. But now, the multiverse is screwed. You only have one universe saved, and I have millions of universes in my pocket, so to speak." Duras roared. Then Duras took a deep breath in, and Billy's body went grey in colour. His life force ripped out of his body, and Duras dropped his skeleton on the ground. Trini burst out from the rubble and let out a blood-curdling scream. She summoned her ultra daggers and launched at Duras. She landed in front of him and swung her daggers multiple times, and Duras blocked each strike. Then, with a gentle push, Trini was sent flying back and crashed into what was left of the back wall. The other heroes climbed to their feet ever so slowly.
So, this is the mastermind.
Mark asked. Yeah. Be careful, Dante growled.
We end this right now.
Jason snapped. Some of the Rangers and Jacob was still unconscious. There was only 5 that stood against those who could not defend themselves and Duras. Jason, Trini, Mark, Dante, and Luca stood before the enemy. I was bored waiting for my... What did you call them? Fadenizers. I was bored waiting for my Fadenizers to collect the rest of you. Thought I would stretch my muscles, so to speak. Duras muttered. All 5 heroes morphed and ran at Duras. The Red Ultra Ranger swung his Ultra Sword down, and Duras caught the blade. He flinched his wrist, and the blade snapped, the pieces raining across the ground. Duras threw a knee up, which collided with the Red Ultra Ranger's chin, knocking him into the air. Then he grabbed the Red Ultra Ranger and tossed him away. The Yellow Ultra Ranger jumped in and stabbed Duras in the sides with her Ultra Daggers. He stood there bleeding. He let out a chuckle, then grabbed the Yellow Ultra Ranger by the helmet and tensed ever so slightly. The Yellow Ranger's visor shattered, and the top of the helmet dented inward. He picked the Yellow Ultra Ranger off the ground and looked her dead in the eye. You loved the nerdy one. You loved Billy Cranston. It's fine. You can see him now. Duras grunted. Then in an instant he drained the Ultra Grid from her. She demorphed and the Ultra Sleeve shimmered on Duras. He gripped Trini by the hair and punched her in the stomach, blood dripping from Trini's limp body. The Red Cornish Ranger and Black Mighty Morphin Ranger both ran at Duras, swinging their weapons. Duras swung Trini and used her body to whack the 2 Rangers back. Then he held Trini up like a trophy. He then inhaled and absorbed her life force. He dropped the remaining skeleton on the ground. The Red Ultra Ranger stood, gripping his arm in pain.
That's it! Screw you!
The Red Ultra Ranger roared. He bolted at Duras, moving at incredible speeds. He punched Duras in the face. Then he jumped up and swung his foot, kicking Duras in the jaw. Duras stood there and wiped the tiniest amount of blood away from his lip. Wow. I've wiped a lot of you Ultra Rangers off the map of the multiverse. Never have I had one that can make me bleed. Not a matter of how small of a drop of blood. It's nothing. Duras grinned. The 3 Rangers and Ultra Rangers stood around Duras.
I'm taking point here. Dante, Luca, keep him busy. Jason, keep back.
The Red Cornish Ranger ordered. He looked to the Red Ultra Ranger, who still gripping his arm in pain. The Red Ultra Ranger could feel every muscle in his body pulsing. He nodded at the Red Cornish Ranger in understanding. The Black and Blue Rangers both summoned their weapons and ran in on the attack, both timing their slashes. Duras stood there and took each slash. A devilish grin hung on his lips. The Red Cornish Ranger tapped his power coin on his belt buckle 5 times. Then he jumped into the air and all 5 power weapons appeared around him. He grabbed each one and one by one he put them together, forming the power cannon. He gripped onto the cannon and aimed it at Duras.
Power cannon! Fire!
The Red Cornish Ranger barked out. Both the Black Ranger and Blue Ranger jumped back as he fired the weapon. The power blast flew at Duras. Duras raised his hand and the blast stopped dead in its tracks. The blast was absorbed into Duras and he let out a satisfying sigh. Tasty. Duras chuckled. The Red Cornish Ranger landed and the power cannon diminished, other than the power sword and the power axe. He tossed the power axe to the Black Mighty Morphin Ranger, who caught it, now wielding both power axes. Power axe! Twin Tusk Formation! The Black Mighty Morphin Power Ranger called out. He ran at Duras at the same time as the Red Cornish Ranger, who swung his power sword. Duras held out both his hands and both Rangers stopped in their tracks, floating a few inches off the ground. Then Duras started draining the morphing grid energy from the power of them. The Blue Ranger started slashing him with his Chrono Saber, and the Red Ultra Ranger pulled out his blaster and from a distance started blasting him. He stood there not paying attention to the Blue Ranger or the Red Ultra Ranger, not fazed by their attacks. Who should I kill first? How about you? Duras growled as he looked at the Black Ranger. He increased his absorbing power and the Black Ranger's suit started glitching. Eventually he demorphed and Dante started to struggle and scream out as he felt his life force being ripped out of him. Then suddenly, Duras was crushed under something big, something that resembled a wolf. The 4 Rangers looked up to see the Predazord knelt there, crushing Duras with the Wolf Zord arm. Dante was pulled up to his feet by the Blue Time Force Ranger, and the Red Ultra Ranger helped the Red Cornish Ranger off the ground as well. You okay, bro? The Blue Ranger asked. Yeah, I think so, Dante grunted. He pulled out his Power Morpher. He looked at it in his palm, but then it glitched away. Dante looked at his wrist and the Lunar Morpher appeared on its strap. Wait, did you just lose your Power Morpher? The Blue Ranger gasped. Yeah, I think so, Dante muttered. The 2 Red Rangers ran up to them.
I've lost access to the power weapons. I now only have 2 weapons, not 7.
The Red Cornish Ranger sighed. A piece of the rubble moved and Jacob climbed out from under the rocks. I got the others. I'll open a portal and get the unconscious back to base, Jacob grunted. The 4 Rangers nodded at him and Jacob got to work. Then a figure landed next to them. Dante bolted forward and hugged his friend. You know, I really don't care for this, Logan growled. Shut up, we thought you lost you, man, Dante muttered. He let go of Logan, who gave a small smile. Logan then looked at the Predazord and it moved its arm, revealing the empty ditch below. He must have escaped, Logan sighed. The 2 Red Rangers demorphed, along with the Blue Ranger.
Thanks for the assist, Logan, right?
Jason asked. Yeah, you must be the one and only Jason, Logan muttered.
We must head back and regroup. We managed to save a universe, but victory came at a loss.
Mark said. His words hung in the minds as they stared at the skeletons of their former allies. Kimberly sat there breathless, tears streaming down her face. Justin punched the wall and everyone sat there in silence.
Please say someone has a plan.
Jason barked out. Actually, yeah, we found something. Whilst you guys were rescuing the hostages, we were looking at footage of the mechas, see how they work. Maybe we could have found a flaw or something. But then we found something rather intriguing. Every single time these things have entered the universe, they have a portal residue. Energy type that you only get when one frequently travels through portals. Like Mark here, for example, he's covered in stuff. We can track that. I think. I might be able to backtrack their steps till we find their home universe. We can take the fight to them, to this Duras character, CJ told them. But surely he would spot us, wouldn't he? He would notice us in an instant. We would need some form of vessel that he would not be able to recognize or track. Our Zords are useless here, Brohan stated. Mark then stood straight up as he remembered something. He remembered the red mecha he found moments before he first ran into the Fadenizers.
I think I know how we are going to sneak into his universe,
Mark stated. Then he pulled out a piece of paper and a pen and started scribbling on it whilst he explained his idea to the rest of them.
What you have just listened to is a product created by the 3 Ranger Bros Studio.
Hosted by 3 cosplaying fathers who
happen to be massive geeks of all sorts of fandoms.
They are Mark, the Red Cornish Ranger,
Cosplay Dude 637,
and Ty Tiger.
The studio covers different types of YouTube videos, TikToks, podcasts, and live streams.
If you wish to find out who cosplays who, the YouTube channel, the TikTok accounts, and the podcasts, and all of the other social media platforms,
please go to the 3rangerbrostudios.com.